Hello, and welcome back to Overwhelmingly Underwhelmed. I'm your host, Lexi. Let's get into it. I do want to talk about the idiocracy that I've seen in the media this week from two particular people, and also then move on to talking about how we have very outdated views of women and we still fail women when it comes to rape cases and sexual assault. So, pretty heavy topics today. If this is something that does trigger you, I would suggest that you either stop watching this, stop listening to this, however you're taking it in. I do have a blog if that's easier for you to take in. If you don't like this and you don't want to think about this or talk about this at all, that's absolutely fine. And I'll see you in the next episode, which might not be as confronting. The point of my podcast was always to get to these types of topics because I think it's really important that we have uncomfortable conversations like this. So I do hope that you stick around, and I will try to keep these topics, whilst they're quite heavy, as light as possible. I do have statistics, and there is a lot of mention of sexual assault and rape. So again, if you are triggered, please turn this off. I'll give you 10 seconds now to leave if this is something that makes you uncomfortable. We love you, and we'll see you next week. For anyone that's stuck around, hello again. Let's get into it. So, this week, I'd like to first start on something that has enraged me a little bit, and it's been covered by the media. And I don't usually talk about people when it comes to my content. I don't talk about celebrities or figures in the media or anything. I try to stay away from that stuff. It's not something that interests me, but this particular news story did interest me, and the way that it's gone has interested me a fair bit. And that is I'm going to read the names because I am not familiar with these figures in the way that I should be in an informed podcast, if that makes sense. So I'm going to give you an uninformed opinion. That's my opinion on what's happening surrounding the Logan Paul fight with someone called Dillon Danis. And I understand that he might be big in the sports world, but he seems like a bit of a fuckwit. So I think that there is a very outdated view around women, around their body count, and around how it devalues them. It's extremely outdated, and it should never have been part of societal view in the first place, but it is. And that's because there are conservative people out there who believe that women should remain untouched for their husband. And off that, which is a religious point of view, I believe, it might be a religious thing, that's fine. If you are part of that type of society, part of that culture, I understand that. That is your beliefs, your views. But that doesn't mean that you should be inflicting it on other people. So, when it comes to women and the purity culture, it shouldn't be inflicted on everybody around the world. But unfortunately, with a bunch of podcast bros, with people making content around women's value being linked to their sexual activity, unfortunately, boys are growing up to believe that women's value is based on how many people they've slept with or their body count. And that is wild to me because if we flip the tables on this and we look at men in general, we can almost always say that you will end up with a man that has a higher body count than a woman. It is a built in part of the patriarchy. And I think a lot of men walk around, even subconsciously, believing that women shouldn't be having sex with other men. Yet, they're also the people who get upset when women won't have sex with them. It doesn't make any sense, and I still pertain to the fact that most men don't know what they want. But when it comes to this particular thing, let's go back to Dillon Danis and Logan Paul. If you don't know what's been happening, apparently Logan Paul and Dillon Danis have a fight coming up. And Logan Paul has a fiance named Nina Agdal. I think that's how you say it. She's a model. She's beautiful. Now, Nina Agdal has dated people in the past, like we all have. Unfortunately for Nina, being in the public eye is never easy. And that means that, there's paparazzi photos of whoever she's dated before. And this guy, Dillon Danis, has taken it on himself to shame Logan Paul through slut shaming his fiance. And to do that, he's taken to Twitter, he's photoshopped photos of Nina with like all of her previous ex-boyfriends, and there's like, I'll post up here now so you can see it. There's like a gotta catch 'em all, and it's Nina at the front with all of the guys that she slept with, and he's just slut shaming Nina, which is something that is extremely outdated. We don't do that in 2023. We know that it doesn't need to be done. Women can have all of the sexual experiences that they want, and it doesn't affect their value at all. And the fact that men still think it does, it's outdated, it's boring, and we're not Neanderthals. Get more than two Tic Tacs rolling around in your brain and read something that doesn't pertain to what your belief system has been because of the patriarchy. It's easy. Anyway, cutting to the chase. This has been like weeks of harassment from Dillon Danis to Logan Paul about this fight. And I understand like there's always pre-fight antics. I understand very little about this fight world. But I know that like leading up to the fight, most fighters seem to try and like psych each other out psychologically, which is fine. It's part of the game. I get it. But never have I seen somebody like this slut shame someone else's fiance. So again, men will not attack other men for the shit that they've done because goodness knows Logan Paul has done a lot of shit, but they will use the women that these men are dating to attack the man, to try and blackmail or psych the man out. It's never man to man. They can't fight man to man. They always have to find another way, and it's always at the expense of a woman. Anyway, allegedly, Dillon Danis has posted explicit images of Logan Paul's fiance on his Twitter. And I think there was a video as well. Don't quote me on that. I'm just reading news articles, so goodness knows what the media blows out. But I think that there was a image and there was a video. This explicit material wasn't something that she had released. So she had to go and find out whether or not she had been hacked. And since that has happened, she has now pulled a restraining order on Dillon Danis and anyone that he has in his circle that would have access to these images. And once that had happened, the response from Dillon Danis made me laugh because a lot of men think that they can get away with anything. And this man is not an exception to the rule. He thought he could get away with this and he's upset now. Now, I understand, I think yesterday or this morning there was a press conference and Logan Paul went and attacked Dillon Danis and said some out of pocket things about his dead father, which I don't condone. I don't think that's cool either. I think that sportsmanship should be sportsmanship, and I think that you should be able to psych out your opponents, but I think you should still do that in a respectful manner because you're disrespecting the sport otherwise. Anyway, let me read to you Dillon Danis's reply to having a lawsuit pulled out against him. I'm just going to read this. Sorry, I'm not looking at the camera for a second. Nina Agdel has filed a massive lawsuit against me. She filed a restraining order against me and is seeking prison time, so the fight is in jeopardy if I'm in jail. This is actually wild, but I won't stop. Fuck the system. Come get me. Logan Paul's a dead man walking. Right? Like, isn't this the consequences of my actions? Oh my goodness, she's filed a lawsuit against me and I could be in jail because I've done some stupid shit. And it might mean that I can't have this fight. At no point did he own up to the stupid shit he's done because obviously he still thinks it's correct. He still thinks he's in the right for having access to explicit images of her, for leaking those, and for pulling the slut shaming card for weeks on end. If I was in her position, I would do exactly the same thing. And I think most women would. To Logan Paul's credit, and I don't think I've said that sentence much in my life, to Logan Paul's credit, he seems to be heavily siding with Nina and protecting her as much as he can. And that came up again in the press conference this morning. I think the point here is that slut shaming is outdated and boring, and men who use women that other men are dating to try and attack them, why don't you grow the fuck up and be better role models for the generation that is coming? Because a woman's value has nothing to do with who she's dated, how many people she's slept with, nothing. Just the same as a man's, right? The second thing I wanted to talk to you today, and it kind of segues into a little bit more of a serious topic, is the Danny Masterson issues that have happened in the media lately and the Ashton Kutcher, Mila Kunis kind of thing that's happened. If you haven't seen Danny Masterson, who is an actor from That 70s Show, which was a show running, I think, up until like the early 2000s, maybe 2006. He played Hyde in that show, and I was a big fan of that show. I really liked it, mostly for the outfits, which we now know why, because I really like fashion, but I was a big fan of that show. There are bits and pieces from that show, like the IRL bits and pieces that I've heard that haven't been the greatest. Like Mila Kunis was very underage when she started and lied about her age and got into the show, and there were some things around that, but that's not what we're focusing on today. We're focusing on the fact that Danny Masterson has been reprimanded for attacking and raping two women 20 years ago, and has been sentenced to life in jail. And I think life in jail in America is 20, 30 years. So I think it's 30 years that he's been sentenced to in jail. Along with that sentencing came out, the media had picked up these letters of support from Mila Kunis and Ashton Kutcher. Now, I've had a little deep dive into these. These letters of support the media had put out at the same time as the sentencing, as in it looked like the sentencing had happened and then Mila and Ashton had put out letters of support for Danny. What had actually happened was that in the court proceedings, to try and help Danny from being sent to jail, the lawyer had asked his friends and family for letters of support and for taking a stance on his character as a person so that it could be given to the court. So it was in the court proceedings. That's neither here nor there within this point. So I'm just correcting that though. So these letters of support from Ashton and Mila were very much saying, how good of a person Danny was, how it would be such a shame if he went to jail because he's got a family and a young kid to bring up, and this young kid shouldn't grow up without a father. And for someone like me who has been in the position of being sexually assaulted, and like as a woman in the world, most of us have been in that position, unfortunately. Watching someone like Ashton Kutcher, who is a co-founder of his own human trafficking organization called Digital Defenders of Children, and seeing him come out with this letter that goes to Danny Masterson's lawyer saying to him, wait, we acknowledge that he's done this stuff, but he's still a good guy, drives me wild. Because that narrative is also old. Just like the slut-shaming narrative, this narrative is also old and it's boring. The amount of things that I have read, especially over in the US where there's been rapes inside a college and a young boy or young man, we could say, has been caught raping somebody or sexually assaulting someone, and the narrative is always, oh, but it's just a mistake. It's going to ruin the rest of his life. Why would you make this one thing ruin the rest of his life? If he goes to jail, it's going to be on his record forever. That kind of stuff drives me wild. Because what do you think happens to the victim of that sexual assault, the survivor? At most of the time, the woman, the young girl that it's happened to. Because I can tell you firsthand, it's not easy moving on after that. That is years of therapy. That is years of having to readjust who you are to try and get back a person that you will never get back. It's not being able to trust men at all, ever. It's having to do years and years of therapy where you're digging and digging and trying to rebuild something that you can't possibly rebuild because someone has come to you, someone possibly that you've trusted, and ripped away something from you that you did not give. There was no consent for that. They just took it. And it is something that you will have nightmares over. It is something that you will have to hide because you think it's shameful. And it's unfortunately a fairly shared experience. And that's just giving it like the nice point of view from the top right now. I'm not even giving you the actuality of having to live through something like that because I'm privileged enough to have gone through years of therapy and I can talk about this stuff. But for a lot of young women and men out there, for a lot of young people, my apology, for a lot of young people out there, that's not the reality. The reality is that they don't have access to programs that can help them. They don't have access to therapy. They don't have access to friends and family that are supportive of these types of things because, again, the system always fails the victims. And it always tries to lift up the people that have made mistakes. I'm sorry, but physically drugging and tying someone down and then sexually assaulting them is not a mistake. It is a choice. And something that I've preached in a lot of the podcasts that you've listened to, if you've been here, is that any type of disrespect in a relationship, it doesn't matter what type of relationship it is a conscious choice. Because that person knows the boundaries as a human being and they still choose to overstep those boundaries. And the only time they're ever upset after that is when they face the consequences of their actions. It wasn't when they actually chose to do it. So in this case, we're watching somebody like Ashton Kutcher and Mila Kunis, who we believe, like before this, haven't really had much negative media circling them to this extent. Watching them go out on the limb and say something stupid and outdated, like, oh, it would be a shame if, Danny's kids didn't grow up with a father. You know what else would be a shame? If the victims of this sexual assault didn't get the justice they deserved. And for the first time in a long time, we're watching somebody who has done a heinous act and actually get the consequences that he deserved. Whether or not he goes through life in jail, which he probably won't because his lawyer will be able to get him out early, get him in probation. I don't know what they do over there in that system. But from what I've seen, less than 1% of sexual assaults actually get to courts and then have a sentencing, let alone a sentencing of life. And on that note, I would like to introduce you to some particular statistics that I went and found just so that you can see how bad the system lets down victims when it comes to sexual assault and rape. So I actually have about 7 pages here, but I'm not gonna go through all of those 7 pages. So I live in Australia, but I'm going to talk about 3 regions, which I think in my statistics, my demographics sit in the US, EU, and the AU. So I'm just going to talk about those 3 regions. And I'd like to also acknowledge, before I talk about those, how problematic other regions of the world are compared to these 3 regions. So these 3 regions have these statistics which are disgusting, but then I know that there are other countries in the world and other areas of the world which are even worse that the media doesn't report on very much. So I acknowledge that. Okay, so in the US, under 1% of reports are convicted. Just to put that into perspective for you, there's 100 people that have been sexually assaulted. One person manages to get through to the system to the point that they get to court, and less than that one person will have a ruling in their favor. So let's talk about how the system fails victims. Over in America, police can mark cases unfounded if the victim was heavily intoxicated and destroy rape kits that women have to go to hospital to get invasively done after the fact to make room in evidence lockers. If the victim was heavily intoxicated, they can destroy a rape kit just based on that. I went through a lot of articles for these statistics, and I will make sure that I put them in the bio of the YouTube video so that you can go and have a read as well, and you can see that they're not taken out of context. It's probably really important for you just to go and have a read and be able to bring these types of facts into conversations that you might be having. CNN reviewed one police department in Springfield, Missouri, where dozens of rape case detectives did not even attempt to contact known suspects, didn't have rape kits tested, and stopped working cases within days or weeks of being assigned to investigate. In Minnesota, the Star Tribune found judges were twice as likely to reduce sentences when the attacker knew the victim. 227 cases, less than a year behind bars, given they knew the victim. The same state where spousal rape was legal up until recently. As victims, we get the question all the time, why didn't you just report it? You can go on social media at any point, find a story. There are countless stories of sexual assault and rape allegations on TikTok, on Instagram, and look at the comments. You will, of course, see the usual man trolls in there who sit in their mother's basements and just attack women and tell them that they have no value. And then you will see the question, why didn't you just report it? Why didn't you go to the police? Why didn't you go to the hospital and get it tested? So I'd like to talk about that today. Moving to Australia, these statistics are disgusting. This is the country that I live in, and I find these extremely disturbing, and I think that they should be known because a lot of people wouldn't go and actually look these statistics up. So recently, The Australian reported that the Uni of Sydney is looking to shut down their accommodation with the statistic that 67% of students have been sexually harassed since the start of their uni journey. According to a government document from the Jenkins Review to the new budget, the gender safety gap is widening. 11% of Australians still believe she's probably lying if she doesn't report it straight away, and this is the highest statistic in the Western world. 10% believe that rape is fine if the woman initiates intimacy in a situation where they've just met. But the thing is, men seem to understand consent perfectly fine when it comes to gay men. There was something called the gay panic defense that has been recently eradicated. And when I say recently, within the last decade, it's been eradicated, where men could pull that out and say that they did something horrible to another man because they thought that man was hitting on them. So On the 1st of December 2020, which is not even 3 years ago, there was a bill passed outlawing the so-called gay panic defense to murder. A man in court could pull the gay panic defense and say that he murdered somebody else because he was afraid of being hit on by another man. And judges and courts would acknowledge that and lessen the sentence because of that. So men seem to understand consent, but only when it comes to other men. They don't seem to understand it when it comes to women or people that they see as lesser. Same as America. Research in Australia shows when victim and rapists have been drinking, police are more likely to question the validity of the rape, view the victim negatively, and judge the assailant as more likable. On a large scale, how can we trust an organization in the police when it's rife with its own discrimination against women? The legal system is permeated with misogynistic attitudes that contribute to blaming women for being raped and protecting men who commit rape. Less than 25% of reports make it to court, and it takes up to 2 years and rarely ends in a conviction. So if you do end up going to report a rape, you will need a rape kit. Let's just go through the steps of this, right? You are sexually assaulted or raped as a woman. Just in this case, we're talking about women. You then have to pick yourself up within 24 to 48 hours and go to a hospital to have an invasive rape kit done. Let me just walk you through that rape kit. Swabs need to be taken from private parts and anatomy. Photographs of said private parts also need to be taken. The lacerations need to be inspected under bright lights. Your sexual history is recorded, which I don't know why. Your clothing and underwear is examined. And this is all preferably hours after the fact, right? So you need to go and process the fact that you have had your trust broken, potentially by somebody that you know, you've been violated, and then you need to go to a hospital to go and get a rape kit done. And then after all of that, less than 25% of reports actually make it to court. And that court proceeding is going to most likely be dragged out to the point that there's very unlikely a conviction. And then you're facing years of therapy, years of nightmares, years of distrust. Listen to this. A 2017 study compared cross-examination of victims in rape trials from the 1950s to similar trials between 1996 and 2011. Despite significant law reform, the tactics used by defense lawyers to discredit victims have barely changed. It was found that modern lawyers use more rape myths and false stereotypes to discredit the character of the victim. So it seems that it's getting worse. And given that we have a gender safety gap widening, it does look like in this country that it is getting worse and worse. I mean, we look at the media and the articles written about sentencing when it comes to sexual allegations. Every day we have a new NRL, AFL, NBL player, whatever it is, a new sports person, assault allegations coming out against them. And still, yet, we watch journalists in the media write full articles about sexual allegations against sports stars, and most of the article just is listing all of the things they've done in their sports career. It's not talking about the victim or the fact that they've made a choice to violate somebody else's body. It's just telling us how important the violator is, how important this person is to society because they've got all of these accolades to their name. And at the very bottom, there's like, oh, by the way, yeah, he sexually assaulted someone, or he allegedly sexually assaulted someone. And then we have somebody like Ashton Kutcher flying in and saying, yes, it would be such a shame if, XYZ's lost their father 2 years in prison for this one mistake that it's not a mistake, it's a choice. If you go and punch someone, if you go and punch your partner in the face, if you go violate somebody else's body, it is a choice. That is not a mistake. You don't get to be forgiven. You don't get to lead a normal life because you've done something to somebody else that is unspeakable, and you've made it impossible for that person to ever get back to the person that they were before. And then you're asking society to turn a blind eye, which, by the way, it does most of the time. Tell me how the system isn't broken. There are a lot of cases here that I've written down where the question, why didn't you report it? It answers that question very well. And if you'd like, I would suggest you go and look some of these cases up. Some of the main cases, I mean, in Australia, Jared Hayne got 4 years and 9 months after being found guilty of 2 counts of rape. like 4 years and 9 months. We had Joseph Ayoub in Canberra. He raped a sex worker, sentenced to 2.5 years. However, as he had served shy of 19 months in custody, the rest of his sentence was suspended and he was issued with a good behaviour bond. Go and look up Sean Bloomfield and Luke Merrifield, who were charged with raping a woman after a party in 2016. And there were 7 years of court proceedings, so that would have dragged out for that victim. I mean, in Scotland, if you go look up Sean Hogg, who raped a 13-year-old when he was 17 in 2018 and was convicted earlier this year, that's 5 years later. And due to new sentencing guidelines for under 25s, he was not jailed and given 270 hours of unpaid work. That 13-year-old, in comparison, faces a lifetime of PTSD, has self-harmed since the day, has undergone 3 years of counseling, nightmares, and relationship problems, and will do so for the rest of her life. Yet this man has to do 270 hours of unpaid work, and according to society, his debt is paid back to this woman's life that he has ruined. And it wasn't a woman, it was a girl. Anyway, but I have to say as well, just so I'm giving you all the facts, he was added to the sex offenders list for 3 years. If he was over 25, he would have only been jailed for 4 years. Let's talk about the US. Let's talk about some of these cases. I mean, we see a lot of medical professionals making a mockery of their profession. Shafiq Sheikh, a former Texan doctor, was found guilty of rape and was sentenced to 10 years probation instead of jail. He sexually assaulted a sedated patient multiple times. He saw somebody sedated and took advantage of the situation for himself and then got 10 years probation, no jail time. Mohammed Bakari Shi, he was 20 years old, raped 2 girls aged 4 and 9 and will receive 180 days in prison. Okay, so there's a lot of these. So I'm going to stop it there because there is a lot and I've got pages and pages of it. But we don't need to go through all of those today. You can go and look online and find these all over the place. And you can also find the prejudice against victims and against women. I mean, in 2015, even before Roe v. Wade was overturned, which we're not diving into today because that is a whole nother topic that I am happy to talk to you about at another time. In Oklahoma, in 2021, a mother was sentenced to 4 years in jail after suffering a miscarriage. When you hear of a story of somebody who has been sexually assaulted, if you are listening to this, I highly suggest that you never ask, why didn't you just report it? Because after listening to the last 20 minutes of me talking, I hope you can understand a little bit more why we don't just report it. Because we're shamed as women, we're shamed as victims and as survivors, we're shamed as people who have allowed this to happen to us because there is that disgusting mindset in society that tells us that victims shouldn't have been wearing what they were wearing. They shouldn't have kissed somebody, or they shouldn't have been drinking. They should always watch out. It's like when I go for a run as a woman at night, if someone attacks me, it's my fault. That kind of narrative is like the slut shaming that we spoke about at the beginning, outdated, old, and it needs to be spoken about, and there needs to be uncomfortable conversations, and you need to stick up for these women and these survivors and these people who are survivors and victims of sexual assault when it comes to your mates, who I can guarantee you, I think we've all met somebody who really needs a whack in the face with reality. And if your mates are being disrespectful towards survivors, towards women in general, you need to pull them in. You need to tell them that it is not acceptable and that we don't accept that here. We allow bad behavior without consequences, and it reflects on the type of person you are. If you've seen something happen and you think that is not my place to comment on, or that is not my place to step in, you are part of the problem. I'm going to leave it there, and this is going to be a bit longer than what I've recently recorded, so I do apologize. I hope that you did get through it. I hope that it wasn't too triggering. I've tried to keep it fairly simple to understand. There's a lot of things that we could dive into. Let me know if you want me to talk more about any of the things you've heard today on this podcast. I hope you go out and have some uncomfortable moments this week that help your growth. Please have some uncomfortable conversations. Those are really important to have. And I'll see you in the next episode.